Hey there, it's Jordan. I'm delighted to be joined by Kshama Sawant, the Seattle City Council member who recently, at the end of last year, fought back a recall that was pushed by the right wing in Seattle, but also a lot of friendly Democrats trying to remove her from office. I wanted to have you on. There's a lot to talk about, but I wanted to start because you've been taking on the Democrats for basically trying to repeal hazard pay still during the very active Omicron surge at grocery stores. I'll just read your tweet for a minute here. Democrats shamelessly tried to repeal $4 an hour hazard pay for grocery workers during the Omicron surge, yet themselves continue to meet only on Zoom for the safety of their own homes as they make six-figure salaries. You added in. Can you kind of talk about, the grocery workers that will be affected by this, and B, what the Democrats' reasoning for this?
Yes, and just to give a context for some of your viewers who may not know what Seattle politics is like, there are 9 council members on the Seattle City Council, 8 Democrats, and me, the lone socialist. And so it's not like they were being pushed by Republicans or the overtly right wing to do this. This was something that they did by themselves. And what's striking about this is that the bill itself was sponsored by Teresa Mosqueda, who's a council member here who has the image of a labor Democrat, and she has the backing of the major labor union leaderships locally in Seattle and King County. And that's what's so stunning about this, because we're talking about a meager $4 an hour grocery worker hazard pay during this pandemic, where our frontline workers have been some of the hardest hit and some of the most self-sacrificing to allow our society to keep running. And for Democrats, and not only on top of that, the labor Democrats to be pushing for this was quite a scandal in my view. And to also get a sense of why this is so scandalous, I think it's important to look at the standard of living that grocery workers are facing. I mean, and to get a sense of how anti-worker this attempt by the Democrats was. And I can also give you a context of why that wasn't only an attempt and the grocery worker hazard pay is still in place, but no thanks to the Democrats, because 8 of them voted unanimously. I was sick on that day and I wasn't able to vote. But all year long last year, I have said that repeatedly, publicly, that not only should we keep this grocery worker hazard pay, in fact, it should be extended to all frontline workers. But to just give a sense of how bad it could be for grocery workers, look at the study released by the Economic Roundtable that was surveying grocery workers in Washington, California, and Colorado. And this survey shows that while Kroger's CEO made $22 million last year, most of the company's frontline workers faced homelessness, eviction, or hunger. To quote from the study, quote, "There are workers sleeping in RVs or couch surfing or living in parks somewhere. Americans go to their local supermarket every week and smile at the person cashing them out, not aware that the person they're talking to is going to sleep in a car after they clock out," end quote. That is how stunning this is, that council members who are sitting safe in their home and doing their job through the Zoom calls are basically proclaiming that we don't need any more protections for grocery workers.
And by the way, I think the study you're talking about, 14% of Kroger workers had experienced homelessness within the past year. Not to mention, I mean, it was very high in terms of food insecurity for Kroger workers. So this is a systemic issue, by the way, not just at Kroger, but that was what the study was about. I also wanted to show, because you referenced a union leader. This is, you had tweeted this, but this is that union leader who basically called it a Band-Aid. Sawant wants to argue about how long to keep the Band-Aid on, while some of us are focused on mending the wound. Well, how are they exactly focused on mending the wound? Have they been fighting to, instead of making this hazard pay, to actually just raise their wages by $4 or $5 an hour?
I mean, I'm sure if you talk to the leaders, they will say that they have been, but let's look at it concretely as well, right? Because the workers, many of them are, I think, heading into contract battles this year. So I will ask just a very simple question. How in any universe can you claim that it is going to put pressure on the Kroger bosses to give a $4 or higher dollar pay, dollar an hour pay for workers permanently when you are freely letting go what you have already won temporarily? You know, it's a simple question of what really allows you to have power in the bargaining, especially in the context of workers being so, you know, it's being a David versus Goliath kind of fight where Kroger Corporation is so powerful and workers need to fight collectively. In other words, my point is that we absolutely need unions, because otherwise, without a collective struggle, individual workers have no hope of fighting the system, fighting capitalism, gaining any kind of change, let alone any kind of systemic shifts in society. But what kind of unions we need, that is the key question here. It's not, unions are very popular now. Since 1965, the unions have never been as popular as they are now. It also raises the question of what kind of unions we need, and then we really need fighting unions. We actually are not going to win for workers if we have union leadership saying things like this, where that they're saying that, well, let's let go of what we have won temporarily, and somehow that is going to be magically the jumping off point, the launching pad to win major victories when you head into contract battles. That's not how it works. It would be disingenuous for any union leader to suggest that. And I think it points towards having very strong rank and file led militant fighting strategy in unions.
Well, I also think, we saw a recent study came out that billionaires added $5 trillion to their wealth during this pandemic. And I know a lot of the media wants to kind of put the pandemic in like past tense. I think that's crazy. I mean, we could talk about that later, but it's not like the wealthy's gains are temporary. They're not. The wealthy's gains are not being pulled back, or that was just for now. So it just seems like there's something wrong when during a pandemic, the wealthy and billionaires added $5 trillion to their wealth, but you have it almost as like kind of common in I don't know, government psychology and mentality that, oh, no. The workers, if they were such heroes, no, we're not going to make that permanent. We're going to call it a Band-Aid and peel it back.
That's an extremely good point, Jordan. I'm so glad you put it that way. The trillions of dollars that the billionaires have earned, those are not temporary. I mean, not unless we have a systemic shift away from capitalism towards socialism, which is why I'm a socialist. But that's a very important point, that the gains that big business and the wealthiest in our society under capitalism make, those are not treated as temporary. In fact, let me give you another example also, which I'm sure you've discussed on your show. The millions of foreclosures that happened to working class and middle class homeowners in the wake of the Great Recession, that home ownership, which was, in many ways, home ownership is the only equity that millions of Americans have, the only kind of equity, if at all you have it. And most young people, millennials, renters don't have any of that. But that wealth, that all those homes that were foreclosed upon, they were not made back to middle class people or working class people. They went into the hands of private equity, and in fact, you have a worse situation now in terms of the lopsided home ownership wealth than you had before the Great Recession. So that is absolutely a brilliant point, and in fact, it's really important to note that this discussion about temporary versus permanent has come up in terms of hazard pay. It's also been true of all the stimulus measures, the child care tax credits, or the student debt forgiveness. All of that has been temporary, and what we need is systemic changes. We need permanent changes, but it is all disingenuous for union leaders who are leading the charge on letting go of temporary measures like hazard pay to claim that somehow that's a launching pad to win permanent gains. We have to call the lie on that and understand that as a matter of fact, what would have been a better strategy would have been to not only retain the hazard pay and to also say that all frontline workers should get that hazard pay as well. There's another thing that this union leader's tweet also said, which I found quite just really stunning in terms of how it doesn't represent the interests of working people and union members, which is one of the justifications that both these union leaders who allowed the hazard pay to that vote to happen, just keep in mind that the hazard pay is still in place, but that's ironically because the corporate mayor Durkin, outgoing mayor, actually vetoed that bill because she took this opportunity to upstage the so-called progressive Democrats and say, no, actually, this is not the point. This is not the moment in time to repeal the hazard pay. Omicron is surging. So that's another example of how the corporate wing of the Democratic Party, the right wing, actually can end up upstaging the so-called progressives. When progressives sell workers out, all it does is create room for the more conservative Democrats or the outright right wing to take charge. And in reality, it's quite problematic that the Democrats who brought this forward and voted for it unanimously, what they said was that when Seattle's hazard pay for grocery workers has been the most generous of any state, of any city, and that it has been the longest lasting. And I find that deeply offensive towards our workers, because that's like saying, oh, you workers, you should be thankful that we were so generous that we gave you more dollars an hour than grocery workers in other cities, and be happy, be thankful that it lasted as long as it lasted, and don't ask for anything more because other workers don't have anything. Do you know what that is? That is the argument of the race to the bottom, telling workers that you should be happy because workers elsewhere are worse off than you. That is the exact logic that workers need to reject, because that is what benefits the ruling class by having us pitted against each other. Instead, what we should be having, what the argument that union leaders should be making, and unfortunately they have not been making, is that we not only need to retain the best that we had won in Seattle, but that we should win the same for all frontline workers in all cities across the nation.
Absolutely. And I wanted to touch on COVID for a second, because honestly, I mean, I can't really bother anymore dealing with the vaccination stuff and a lot of misinformation about that. But, it's almost like the media a couple of weeks ago got on a conference call in the morning and like they all just decided we're going to stop covering this as much, or we're only going to cover the debates over masks and things like that. But we're not really going to. We're basically going to normalize, like yesterday, literally 3,570 people died. You won't even hear it on the news. Yes, I mean, the average case count is still extremely high. I mean, it's not a million or whatever it was weeks ago during the surge, but it's 250, 260,000 cases. You still have very high hospitalization, about 100,000. And, it's questionable. The numbers, cases, it's kind of a crapshoot. I mean, it could be more. Deaths is still very high, but you kind of see this. It almost seems like big business has spoken and the media is listening to just kind of, hey, this has been going on too long. Everybody, we have fatigue. As some guests on popular shows, I'm over it. Can you kind of talk about that? Because to me, I don't know. Maybe I'm just old-fashioned. I think over 3,000 people dying is still a major news story. That's a 9/11 every day. Not to mention, if you actually look at the map, we still have high contagion and infection areas basically across the country.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, it doesn't even have to be the matter of opinion of some people on the left like you and I. Look at what the World Health Organization is saying. They have been very clear that actually they are extremely concerned, and they don't agree. They are extremely concerned about and don't agree with this whole idea of pandemic to endemic that has happened. And I think you're totally right that it's almost like on one day, the corporate leadership of this country, the ruling class decided collectively that we are going to go away from reporting on the pandemic, reporting on how serious it is. And it's actually illustrates why it is so crucial that we have left-wing media like yours, like Democracy Now, like, the very few precious outlets we have that are actually covering this truthfully. This is so crucial. But it also shows you, I mean, all of the fact that they're acting like this is now, we can go back to business as usual, that really shows you more than anything else the complete failure of capitalism to deal with something like the pandemic. I mean, the capitalism has failed to deliver on basic standards of living, and that has been true for decades throughout the world. It's also shown that it's completely incapable of dealing with the climate crisis, and it has shown itself completely incapable of dealing with something like the pandemic. And so on so many fronts, this has been complete shambles. Look at, as you said, the vaccination scandal. Globally, this has been a complete scandal in how unequal it has been. Democracy Now! Recently reported on how Pfizer has been amassing profits at the expense of millions of people's lives potentially. We have to see what the epidemiologists say, but I have no doubt that the deaths are in very high numbers. The deaths, that could have been prevented had vaccines been made available equitably. And so you look at that, that's a scandal, and then look at the complete failures of the Biden administration to deliver on any of the things that were supposed to be delivered, especially, not only, but especially in the context of the pandemic. And in fact, that is going to be the paramount reason why very likely, and this, in fact, all corporate news outlets have also been forced to report, predict, which is that because of Biden's failures to deliver on any of their key promises, they're going to see a complete massacre in the midterm elections.
And, to me, and I've seen this on the road, particularly covering the presidential campaigns, this repeated, dangling of temporary goods to the working class, calling them heroes and then pulling it back, the repeated lies. People forget Biden during the Democratic primary in a debate said treatment will be free for coronavirus, not just testing if you are hospitalized, free. That hasn't been true. Just in my life, I've talked to people that are nearly bankrupt from a week hospitalization with COVID. The list goes on and on and on. Big pharmaceutical companies increased their prices by 6% just so far this year. And to me, what I'm seeing is all of this is creating a vacuum for more people to be sucked into conspiracies, to be sucked into a right-wing, fascistic mentality under the guise of pushing back against the establishment. Can you kind of talk about, I'm just seeing this slow creeping further move right among working class people that have been so battered and bruised that they are more susceptible to that kind of message?
I think it's true. In fact, it has been a process, right? The pandemic has just exacerbated that. But even before that, we saw, Trump's first election in the first place was a consequence of the Democratic Party having completely failed to provide any kind of working class agenda. After they destroyed Bernie Sanders' chances to become the nominee, and which was a calculated effort. It's not that he lacked in popularity, that his working class program of Medicare for all, of ending student debt, taxing Wall Street, that was extremely popular. And in fact, it brought in wide swaths of people, many of whom who ended up becoming Trump supporters or just stepped out of politics, became apolitical, felt demoralized and disenchanted from politics entirely. And so that process has already been in play for more than 4 years. And now we are seeing an exacerbation of that under Biden with their failures to have delivered on anything. And then, for many months we heard this mantra of, okay, let everything be set aside. Don't forget that they didn't win $15 an hour. Forget that they didn't deliver on Medicare for all. But Build Back Better is going to happen. And look at the shambles that's in. So I think it really shows you the failure, how the failures of the Democrats are directly tied to what working class people feel as a whole. And I do think that, as you were alluding to, there is a real danger of some really far-right elements gaining ground. And in fact, we should not rule out Trump himself making a comeback. And unfortunately, this is at the doorstep of the Democratic Party. But I don't think we can only say it's the Democrats and it's Biden. Obviously, they are completely responsible for this. But we also, on the left, we also have an obligation to point out, okay, so if that doesn't work, the Democrats, putting your faith in the Democratic Party doesn't work, what's the alternative? The alternative is to build like separate independent political organizations for the left, for working class people. And that is where I think that's the most difficulty, in the sense that a lot of good people, well-meaning people, have in the past years, in the last 4 or 5 years, put their faith in progressive Democrats, progressives like Pramila Jayapal and AOC and the rest of the squad members. And we've seen that strategy does not work. I mean, I don't care how well-meaning some of them might be, although I don't accept that all of them are well-meaning, but even if you assume that, the fact is that this strategy of generally making peace with the Pelosi Democratic Party, but also saying, yes, I support Medicare for all, and sometimes doing some actions like the action that Cori Bush and AOC did against the repealing of the eviction moratorium, actions like that, I completely support. But the strategy of occasionally doing that, but mostly making peace with the Democratic establishment, that has failed. And that is what we have to point to, that doesn't work. And the left needs an independent political strategy in order to actually make a shift. If we want to prevent the right wing from winning, then we need that strategy. And in fact, we cannot only focus on elected officials. We have to demand that approach from labor leaders. And that is why we need a revitalization of the labor movement, not only new union drives like Starbucks, which is huge, monumentally important, but within existing unions, we need a fighting approach. We need rank and file led militant labor struggles. And we need that kind of accountability from social movement leaders also. Are you going to tie yourself to the Democrats and defend them when they repeal something like the grocery worker hazard pay? Or are you, as a union leader, as a social movement leader, going to stand with the working people who need your support?
And what does that look like? Because, there's obviously been a heated debate about Dem enter versus Dem exit. I mean, honestly, I tell people, do what's in your heart. I'm not going to try to shepherd people into the Democratic Party or out of it. But I also have to be realistic. I mean, the Green Party hasn't had much success. Movement for a People's Party doesn't have any candidates, and they've been working to build for many years. Obviously, you have things like Socialist Alternative. But how electorally, if we're basically trying to fit a square peg into a round hole with the Democratic Party, how do you build electoral power if the odds are obviously stacked against us third party wise?
Yeah, just the way you framed your question, I think I really appreciate that, because, the electoral power, so to say, if you want to call it electoral power, you cannot build that separate from mass movements. It has to be tied to that strategy. So ultimately, it would be pointless for us to talk about individual campaigns, although I do have something to say about individual campaigns. It does matter what kind of campaigns and candidates you run. But setting that aside for a second, just to explain the underlying idea that it's not possible to run electoral campaigns by themselves that are divorced from the larger strategy of how we are going to make social change possible. And that larger strategy does involve all those things that I just mentioned. For example, when we have social movements like Black Lives Matter, what are the demands we are going to put forward as a movement? What are the requirements we will have for leaders to be accountable to the movement? Meaning, what is it that actually we want to win from this movement in order for the lives of our Black community members to be improved? That's an example. If we're talking about the labor movement, then we're talking about, do we have a leadership in our labor unions that is willing to fight, like, for example, the West Virginia teachers fought back? Is it willing to put forward that kind of strategy which unifies all the rank and file together and demands accountability from leadership, and a rank and file led movement that is even willing to openly defy union leaders when they sell us out? That's important. We just saw some of that play out in the carpenter strike in the Pacific Northwest. The workers didn't win everything they want to win. We have to have a sober reflection. But what is important to note is that the rank and file did experience a little bit of that feeling of standing up to the leadership that has sold them out, and the leadership sold them out spectacularly. In fact, the aftermath of that struggle has been that the entire leadership of the Pacific Northwest Carpenter, Council has been forced to resign because they were exposed in all kinds of wrongdoing. So I think there are glimmers of hope where we know that workers are ready to fight back. The incredible union drive of Starbucks Workers United shows that there is a whole layer of millions of young people who not only want to unionize, but are ready for that fighting approach. What's lacking, principally what's lacking, I'm not saying everybody's on the same page at all times, but what I'm saying is what is principally lacking and has been lacking is that kind of leadership. And so back to your electoral question, we need a new party for the working class. Absolutely. And and that's why myself and other members of Socialist Alternative, we say it like that. We don't claim to be the new party. Socialist Alternative has played an important role, and we want to continue to play that important role, but we need a much bigger platform for working class people nationwide if we are actually going to present a challenge to the Democrats. But it's not going to happen in a vacuum. I mean, when Bernie was running, even both in 2016 and also in 2020, we said, Socialist Alternative publicly said that one, it is important for him to run through the end of the general election as an independent. Even if the Democratic Party throws him out, he has to run as an independent. He didn't do that. He disagreed with us on that. We also said that coming out of that election, win or lose, he should help establish a broad-based organization that can be rooted in ordinary people's lives, really play a role in ongoing struggle. And then coming out of that struggle, we can build electoral campaigns as well. That didn't happen. So in other words, what I'm saying is that no one campaign can do it, but we have to go in that direction. And I'll say this one last thing. A lot of people on the left, and I get asked this question a lot, that, oh, don't we need hundreds of candidates that will call themselves socialist in name or whatever? And look, yes, that would be fantastic, but it is not what you call in name. AOC called herself socialist in name, but that strategy didn't work. And here's what I would say. What we have shown through Socialist Alternative's approach in Seattle is the lesson. And I don't say it because it's my organization. I'm saying it because that is the correct way to do it, because we have proven over 8 years that this works. You can actually mobilize and organize working people on a fighting strategy. We didn't invent it, but we've demonstrated it in these years. And that's what's important. There's a long history behind it. And so even if we had one single congressional campaign, for example, election campaign, that was run on this basis, on a fighting platform where you were not worried about your relationship with Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer or whoever, but you ran to fight, and in the process you could win. But even if you didn't win, and look, we have won 4 times, so we have shown that you can win. But even if you didn't win, what you would do would be far more important, which is show the example of a right kind of campaign.
Absolutely. And before I let you go, I'd be remiss. You are in the belly of the beast, Seattle, where Amazon is headquartered. You mentioned Starbucks, which obviously has had historic success. I covered the Buffalo Workers Union Drive before they won. And now I believe it's up to 70 or 80 stores around the country have filed for a union. So Starbucks obviously has momentum. I've also been covering in New York the massive Staten Island warehouse where workers have been organizing for nearly a year. They just finally won the first battle because they were awarded an election. We don't have a date yet, but they will have an election. It is uniquely more difficult, I would say, for these Amazon workers because you're talking about an over 5,000 worker warehouse with a 150% turnover rate. So Starbucks, historic, but you're talking a couple dozen workers in each store versus thousands in this warehouse. But not surprisingly to you, I just broke this week, Amazon has increased their union busting at this warehouse. They're back to holding mandatory daily union busting sessions. In one session, which we captured video and got the video, you had a general manager demanding that the union organizers leave the union busting session. So they would basically have, straight access to workers that might be on the fence. I just broke today that they're sending out more anti-union signs throughout the warehouse. So I wanted to ask you, because Amazon has been part of campaigns to remove you from office. What is your response to the initial success of They've been awarded a union election in Staten Island. Of course, those in Bessemer, Alabama, now have their second election. What's your response to that and Amazon's fierce continued union busting?
I mean, Amazon's fierce, vicious union busting absolutely is what happens under capitalism. In fact, it's important that we are in workers are able to now see it's both Amazon and Starbucks. I mean, the point being that it's not that there's one uniquely evil corporations. This is an evil system, and what you see the most mega corporations do will be some of the most vicious tactics, but it's not new, and it's not going to be it's not going to be over if it's not Amazon but some other corporation. But you see some of the worst practices in corporations like Amazon. In fact, it's interesting that Amazon and Starbucks are both headquartered in Seattle. This week we were able to win on Tuesday. We were able to win. Our office was able to win a resolution alongside Starbucks Workers United, the union that is unionizing with the Starbucks workers, a resolution demanding that Starbucks stop its union busting. And of course, the resolution also contains language about union busting in general. And as far as the Bessemer and the New York campaigns are concerned, it really showed you what happened in Bessemer, showed you, and one sober lesson for all of us on the left, for all of us in labor, is that you can never underestimate your enemy. Never underestimate your enemy. That's rule number one of going into class battle. And so that is now a continuing reminder for us, especially with what Amazon has ramped up its tactics on Staten Island. And I think overall, what's happening at Amazon and Starbucks, all of it, we can draw generalized lessons from all of it. And one lesson, of course, as I said, is don't underestimate the bosses and their motivation to attack you. We just saw Memphis workers in Starbucks, the whole organizing committee being fired. And now it's important that there are solidarity actions everywhere in order to reinstate those workers' jobs back. But it also is a lesson on other kinds of strategy questions. The best way of showing up workers against this kind of union busting, and some of this we're already seeing, some of the correct things that we're already seeing in some of these struggles, is to have very clear demands, and the demands that have the potential to unify the maximum of the workforce in that corporation. So whether it is $20 an hour or full health care for all workers, regardless of how many hours they work, whatever that specific demand might be, when you're talking about Starbucks or Amazon, the breaks, democratic decision making on breaks, shifts, and all of that. All of those concrete demands need to be spelled out in the open, because when workers are hit with the anti-union propaganda, the union and the left as a whole needs a counter to that. And the best counter is not to be on the defensive, but to be on the offensive. When the bosses tell the workers, you don't need a union, the union just wants your dues. Well, what's the best counter to that? The best counter is to show the workers what they could win with the union. Not just say, oh, it would be good to have a union, or you can sit at the bargaining table. And you should never use language like that. It should be, you can actually win $20 an hour before tips if we have a fighting union. We can actually win shift, schedule democracy or whatever. Or full health care. We could win this, that, and the other. Concrete demands need to be spelled out. And I would, if that's not already being doing, I would urge that we do that in all of these struggles. And I know some of that is already being done. And then the third thing, of course, there's a lot to say, but the third thing I would say is the community solidarity that needs to be built. And that's why it's really important also to learn lessons from the West Virginia teachers who, for a long period before they actually declared their strike action, they had already been building that kind of solidarity in the community. They even went as far as packing lunches for their students, because many of their students come from very poor families. And that was not only important in itself, as a matter of humanity, but also because that was a very important measure to make sure that there was full unity in the community. It's families, children, teachers, and all the other public school workers. That kind of solidarity is what broke the Republican legislature and force them to concede those demands. And that kind of solidarity is what gave the teachers the courage to also defy some of the union leaders who had bad measures.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think it's important to get out what local Democrats are trying in Seattle, what national Democrats are not trying on our behalf. And I'm happy we got into these other topics too. Thank you, Kshama Sawant, Seattle City Council member, Socialist Alternative. We will stay in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching, and make sure to tune in to Status Coup's daily live stream Monday through Thursday at 5 o'clock Eastern Time and Fridays at 4 o'clock Eastern Time.